The Christmas lights still twinkled on Sawyer Road that morning, their colored bulbs casting soft halos through the frost-covered windows. Inside the small brick house at the end of the street, where the pecan tree stood sentinel in the front yard, silence had settled like a shroud. It was December 25th, 1977, Christmas morning, the kind of morning when children tear through wrapping paper and families gather around tables laden with ham and sweet potato pie. But in this house, in this room, there would be no gathering. Kenneth Evans turned the key in his grandmother's front door, balancing a plate of Christmas breakfast his mother had prepared. He called out her name, Alma, Grandma Alma. The word echoed down the narrow hallway. He stepped inside, his shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor. The television was still on, its blue glow washing over the living room furniture. He called again. Nothing. And then he walked into the bedroom, and what he saw there would burn itself into his memory for the next 44 years. His grandmother lay stretched across the bed, her body positioned in a way that made his stomach turn, her clothing torn and scattered. At 77 years old, Alma Jones had survived the Depression, raised children, buried a husband, and carried herself with the dignity of a woman who had seen both the cruelty and beauty of this world. But she had not survived the night before Christmas. Someone had taken that from her. Someone had stolen into her home while the neighborhood slept off their Christmas Eve celebrations and committed an act so brutal, so senseless, that it would haunt an entire community for nearly half a century. If my story resonates with you, please hit the like button to bring a little light to this father's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss my upcoming life stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me so happy to know what corner of the country or world you're listening from. Southeast Raleigh in 1977 was a tapestry of close-knit African-American families who knew each other's business, watched each other's children, and gathered on front porches when the heat of summer made the indoors unbearable. Alma Jones was a fixture in this neighborhood, a matriarch who had lived on Sawyer Road for decades. She was a woman of routine, attending church every Sunday, tending to her garden where collard greens grew in neat rows, and sitting on her porch in the evenings, waving to neighbors as they passed. She lived alone after her husband's death, but she was never truly alone. Her children visited regularly. Her grandchildren dropped by with plates of food and stories from their lives. She was beloved, respected, a woman who represented the strength of generations past. The neighborhood itself was modest, working-class homes with small yards and cars parked in driveways. Children rode bicycles down the street. Dogs barked from behind chain-link fences. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where trust was currency, where the idea of violence against an elderly woman in her own home seemed impossible. But on Christmas Eve 1977, as families prepared for the holiday, as carols played on radios and the smell of baking pies drifted through kitchen windows, someone in that neighborhood, someone who walked those same streets, harbored a darkness that would shatter that sense of safety forever. The police arrived at Alma Jones's home on Christmas morning to a scene that defied comprehension. The elderly woman lay deceased in her bedroom, and the initial assessment by responding officers was cursory, perhaps too cursory. In an era before the sophisticated forensic protocols that would later become standard, before DNA evidence revolutionized criminal investigations, the first responders made a determination that would delay justice for decades. They classified her death as natural causes. An elderly woman, they reasoned, had simply passed away in her sleep. It was Christmas Day. Perhaps they wanted to believe in the innocence of the season. Perhaps they could not fathom that someone would commit such violence against a grandmother in her own home. But Alma's family knew better. They saw the signs, the disturbed bedroom, the torn clothing, the position of her body. They demanded answers, pushed for a more thorough examination, refused to accept the narrative that their strong, healthy grandmother had simply died of natural causes on Christmas Eve. Their persistence eventually led to a more detailed investigation, and the truth emerged like a wound opening. Alma Jones had been raped and murdered, strangled in her own bed by an intruder who had violated not just her body, but the sanctity of her home and the trust of an entire neighborhood. The initial investigation moved slowly, hampered by the limitations of 1970s forensic science, and perhaps by an unconscious bias that elderly victims, particularly elderly black victims in working-class neighborhoods, did not warrant the same urgency as other cases. Detectives interviewed neighbors, collected what evidence they could from the crime scene, and developed theories about who might have committed such a heinous act. The neighborhood became a place of suspicion and fear. People who had once left their doors unlocked now installed deadbolts. Women who had lived alone began staying with relatives. Parents walked their children to school rather than letting them go alone. Everyone had theories. Everyone looked at their neighbors with new eyes, wondering which face might hide a monster. There were suspects, of course. There always are. Men with criminal records, drifters who had been seen in the area, anyone who seemed even slightly out of place. But without physical evidence to link any suspect to the crime, without the DNA technology that would later become the gold standard of criminal investigation, the case began to cool. Weeks turned into months. The detectives moved on to other cases, other victims, other families demanding justice. The evidence from Alma Jones's home, the cigarette butt found near her bed, the blanket bearing the attacker's semen, the fingerprints lifted from her doorframe, all of it was catalogued, boxed, and stored in the police department's evidence room. And there it sat, gathering dust while the years rolled on. Meanwhile, life in southeast Raleigh continued, but it was forever changed. Kenneth Evans, the grandson who had discovered his grandmother's body, carried the image with him like a scar. He would describe it decades later as a vision that sticks with you. The sight of someone you love stretched out and violated, the innocence of Christmas morning forever tainted by that discovery. The family held a funeral, buried Alma Jones with prayers and tears, and tried to move forward while carrying the weight of unanswered questions. Who had done this? Why? Was it random, or had someone targeted her specifically? The lack of answers was its own form of torture, a wound that could not heal because it remained open, unresolved. Alma's great-great-granddaughter, Taya Evans Petrus, grew up hearing stories about her ancestor, about the brutal way she died, about the theories that circulated through the family like ghosts. Some believed it was someone from the neighborhood. Others thought it might have been a stranger passing through. But no one knew for certain, and that uncertainty was corrosive, eating away at the family's sense of peace. Christmas became a day of mourning rather than celebration, an annual reminder of loss and injustice. The family would gather, but there was always an empty chair, always a conversation that turned to Alma and the killer who had never been caught. The killer, meanwhile, continued his life. Paul David Crowder, Jr., was 35 years old in 1977, a man living in the same neighborhood where he had committed his crime. He walked the same streets as Alma's family. He may have passed them in the grocery store, sat near them in church, smiled and nodded when they crossed paths. He lived among them for decades, carrying his secret like a stone in his chest. Did he think about what he had done? Did he see Kenneth Evans and remember the old woman whose life he had taken? Did he feel remorse? Or was he capable of compartmentalizing his brutality so completely that he could function as a normal member of society? These questions would never be answered because Crowder died in 2015, taking whatever emotions or justifications he harbored to his grave. But during those decades between the crime and his death, he lived free while Alma's family lived with their grief. He celebrated holidays while they mourned. He grew older, perhaps had children of his own, went about his daily routines, all while the evidence that would eventually identify him sat in a box in a police evidence room, waiting for technology to catch up with justice. In 2011, 34 years after Alma Jones was murdered, a detective named Jerry Falk was overseeing the transfer of old evidence boxes within the Raleigh Police Department. It was routine work, the kind of administrative task that most detectives found tedious, moving boxes from one storage area to another, updating inventory lists, ensuring that decades-old cases maintained their chain of custody. But as Falk moved these boxes, one caught his attention, the name Alma Jones, the date December 1977. He opened the box and began reading through the case file, and something about it compelled him to dig deeper. Every case is important, he would later say. Every victim is important. But this particular case, it's an elderly female who lived alone, and it's just a brutal crime. The advancement of forensic science since 1977 had been revolutionary. DNA analysis, which was barely understood in the late 70s, had become a powerful tool for solving crimes. Genetic genealogy, the process of using DNA databases to identify suspects through their relatives, had cracked cases that once seemed impossible to solve. Falk submitted several items of evidence to the North Carolina State Crime Lab, including that cigarette butt and the semen-stained blanket from Alma's bedroom. The lab developed a male DNA profile, a genetic fingerprint of the killer. They entered it into CODIS, the national DNA database, searching for a match. But there was nothing. The killer's DNA was not in the system, which meant he had either never been arrested for a crime serious enough to warrant DNA collection, or he had committed this crime before mandatory DNA collection became standard practice. For another decade, the case languished. The DNA profile existed, but without a match it was simply data, potential energy, waiting for a catalyst. Then in 2021, Raleigh police investigators secured funding through the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative and approval to use forensic genetic genealogy, the same technique that had famously identified the Golden State Killer in California. They sent the remaining DNA extracts from the 1977 crime scene to Uproar, Inc., a laboratory in Houston that specialized in using advanced DNA sequencing to create comprehensive genealogical profiles. Uproar used what they call forensic-grade genome sequencing to build a family tree from the killer's DNA, identifying not just the individual, but their relatives, distant cousins, anyone who shared genetic markers. This profile was returned to the Raleigh police, who then worked with the FBI offices in Charlotte and Baltimore to perform genealogical research. It was painstaking work, tracing family lines, building out family trees, looking for connections between the DNA profile and actual human beings who walked the earth. And slowly, meticulously, the investigators narrowed their search until they arrived at a name. Paul David Crowder, Jr., a man who had lived in southeast Raleigh in 1977, a man who had lived in the same neighborhood as Alma Jones, a man who, crucially, had died 6 years earlier in 2015. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Raleigh Police Department and, when announced publicly in September 2021, through the entire community. Paul Crowder had been a neighbor, someone who had likely crossed paths with Alma Jones, who knew the layout of the neighborhood, who understood the routines of its residents. He was not a stranger, not a drifter passing through. He was one of them. The investigators needed confirmation, and they turned to Crowder's family. Approaching the relatives of a deceased suspect is delicate work, fraught with ethical considerations and emotional landmines. These family members had known Crowder, perhaps loved him, had their own memories and relationships with him. Now they were being asked to provide DNA that would posthumously brand him as a rapist and murderer. But one family member agreed to provide a saliva sample, and when that DNA was compared to the profile from the 1977 crime scene, it confirmed what the genealogical research had suggested. Paul David Crowder, Jr. was Alma Jones's killer. The case was solved. After 44 years, the family finally had their answer. But because Crowder was already dead, because he had lived his full life and died without ever facing justice, there would be no arrest, no trial, no opportunity for the family to look their grandmother's killer in the eye and demand answers. The case was classified as exceptionally cleared, a law enforcement term meaning solved but closed due to circumstances beyond the department's control, in this case, the death of the suspect. Kenneth Evans, who had spent more than 4 decades carrying the image of his grandmother's body, learned the killer's name in 2021. It was a good feeling, he said, though the words seemed inadequate for the complex emotions of finally knowing who had destroyed his Christmas morning in 1977. The police department didn't let us down, he added, acknowledging the persistence of investigators like Jerry Falk, who refused to let the case fade into obscurity. Taya Evans Petrus, Alma's great-great-granddaughter who had grown up with the story of her ancestors' murder, said it felt really good to know and understand their history. But understanding came with its own burden. Now they knew that the killer had been so close, had perhaps smiled at them in passing, had lived and died without consequence. The neighborhood, too, grappled with this revelation. People remembered Paul Crowder, or remembered the Crowder family, and now had to reconcile their memories with this horrifying truth. It raised uncomfortable questions about how well we truly know our neighbors, about what darkness can lurk behind familiar faces. The announcement by Raleigh Police Chief Estella Patterson was measured and respectful. While we recognize that this conclusion will not ease the pain and loss the family has experienced, she said, "We are pleased that they finally have resolution to something they have lived with for a long time. Resolution, but not justice in the traditional sense. Justice would have been Paul Crowder standing in a courtroom, facing the evidence, hearing the verdict, spending the remainder of his days behind bars. Instead, he had died peacefully in 2015 at the age of 73, the same age Alma Jones had been when he killed her. He had lived 38 more years than his victim, 38 years of freedom, of experiences, of life that he had stolen from her. The family took what comfort they could from finally knowing the truth. They held each other and cried, relief and grief mixing together in a bittersweet catharsis. They could finally stop wondering, stop theorizing, stop living with the uncertainty that had plagued them for nearly half a century. But they also had to live with the knowledge that the man who had destroyed their family's peace had never faced earthly consequences for his actions. The Alma Jones case became one of many examples of how modern forensic science, particularly genetic genealogy, has revolutionized cold case investigations. Across the country, police departments have begun reopening old cases, submitting evidence to laboratories like Othram, and using DNA databases to identify suspects who thought they had gotten away with murder. The success stories are numerous, cases that sat cold for 30, 40, even 50 years, suddenly solved by genetic technology that did not exist when the crimes were committed. But these successes also highlight a troubling reality, that justice delayed is often justice denied. Many of the suspects identified through these means are already deceased, like Paul Crowder, or are elderly and infirm by the time they are caught. They lived most of their lives in freedom, while their victims' families lived in anguish. The families are grateful for answers, but there is always a bitter edge to that gratitude, a sense of what might have been if the technology had existed sooner, if the investigation had moved faster, if somehow the killer had been caught before he died. In southeast Raleigh, on Sawyer Road, where Alma Jones once tended her garden and waved to neighbors from her porch, life continues. The neighborhood has changed over the decades. Some of the families who lived there in 1977 have moved away. New families have moved in, unaware of the history beneath their feet. The small brick house where Alma was murdered may still stand, or it may have been torn down and replaced. But her memory persists, carried forward by her descendants who refuse to let her be forgotten. Every Christmas, when the lights twinkle and families gather, they remember the grandmother who should have been there, whose life was cut short by a neighbor's violence. They remember, and in remembering they keep her alive. The case of Alma Jones reminds us that monsters do not always look like monsters. They look like neighbors, like familiar faces in the grocery store, like men who mow their lawns and go to work and blend seamlessly into the fabric of everyday life. Evil can wear a mask of normalcy, and that is perhaps more terrifying than any stranger in the shadows. The resolution of this case, 44 years in the making, stands as both a triumph and a tragedy. A triumph of persistence, of technological advancement, of investigators who refuse to let an elderly black woman's murder be forgotten in the shuffle of passing decades. But a tragedy too, because Paul Crowder lived his entire adult life without answering for what he did on Christmas Eve 1977. He went to bed each night in his own home, while Alma Jones lay in a grave. He celebrated holidays, marked milestones, perhaps even complained about trivial inconveniences, all privileges denied to the woman he murdered. The DNA that finally identified him, the genetic code that proved his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt, was always there waiting in that evidence box, a silent witness to his crime. It took 34 years for someone to look, and another 10 years for technology to catch up with justice. That is the cruel mathematics of cold cases. Time measured not just in years, but in missed opportunities, in holidays without answers, in families aging and dying without closure. Safety is an illusion we construct to make sense of the world, to allow ourselves to sleep at night, to let our children play outside, to trust that our neighbors mean us no harm. But cases like Alma Jones's shatter that illusion, reminding us that violence can erupt anywhere, can come from anyone, can steal away someone we love in the time it takes for the Christmas lights to blink out. We cannot live in constant fear, cannot barricade ourselves against every potential threat, but we can remember. We can honor victims like Alma Jones by refusing to look away, by demanding that investigators continue their work even when years have passed, by supporting the forensic technologies that bring closure to grieving families. We can recognize that justice, even when delayed, even when the perpetrator is beyond earthly punishment, still matters. It matters to the families left behind. It matters to the community searching for peace. It matters because every victim deserves to be more than an unsolved case file gathering dust in an evidence room. They deserve to be remembered, their stories told, their lives honored, and their killers named. Alma Jones was 77 years old when she died. She was a grandmother, a neighbor, a woman of dignity and strength. She deserved to grow even older, to hold more great-grandchildren, to sit on her porch on warm evenings and watch the sun set over Sawyer Road. That was stolen from her, and no amount of DNA evidence or posthumous identification of her killer can return those years. But her family has their answer now. They know who. They know why, as much as anyone can understand the motivations of a murderer. And in that knowing there is a kind of peace, fragile and hard-won, built on the foundation of truth that took 44 years to uncover. May Alma Jones rest finally in that peace.